Okay. Good morning again. I am Agustin Rodriguez, the Transportation and Planning Engineer for CRTPO. And it is my pleasure to have the second and last workshop of the funding alternatives and post-study expectations. This meeting or workshop today will be identical or a repeat of the one conducted last week. Next, please. Our agenda for today, we're going to start with the welcome and attendance. I'll take attendance in a second. Then go over a progress overview summary, followed by the funding alternatives and regional investment strategies, where we are going to try to spend the most amount of time on that segment. Then briefly, we're going to touch on the connection with parallel planning initiatives, funding alternative tool. Briefly, we're actually switching those, the order of those. So we're going to be doing the post-study expectation discussion. We're also going to be seeking input from this group. Then switch over to the funding alternative tools. And last but not least, final thoughts and next steps. Next. So I won't go. I know last time we went over each of the jurisdictions and agencies. I'm just going to go through the list of participants that I see on the screen. And if I miss anyone, just let me know after I'm done. But I see Adam Howell with Atkins, Judy Delero-Kidd with CRTPO, Alex Raimondi with Charlotte DOT, Andy Grimsky with Charlotte DOT, Ben Stein with Atkins, Brian Elgore with CRTPO, Dr. Mike Miltek with Cornelius and board and shadow of the CRTPO board, Gary Fournier. I think he will have to help me with which agency he is. Gerald Leonard with CRTPO.
Gary Fournier, Town of Cornelius Planning.
Cornelius, thank you. There was Jorge Luna with HDR, Kathy Cornett with Charlotte Planning Department, Loretta Barron with the Federal Highway Administration, Stuart Basham with NCDOT Division 10, Warren Cooksey with NCDOT Turnpike Authority. Is there anyone who I missed? Oh, and I see Jim Conti just joined us with the Conti group. Anybody else?
Dominic Boyd, NCDOT Transportation Planning Division.
All right, good morning, Dominic. Okay, without further ado, let's move to the next agenda item. We're gonna be doing some survey questions. So have in handy, Judy, if you don't mind putting the code on the chat box for Mentimeter later on. 8943 9523.
We'll be asking some good questions for all of you to provide some feedback on. Some of them are originally intended for elected officials only, but I do recognize that we only have one elected official on today's call, and so we will open it up for everybody. You know, Mike, I know that all you elected officials have a secret text chain, so maybe you can just text them all and say, jump on, jump on. So we'll just dive right in and we'll get to those questions shortly. Just to kind of give you a quick recap, many of you have been involved with our previous presentations, especially the most recent one to our steering committee. So a lot of you have seen this information already, but the phase 1 public engagement data dashboard is now published and available online, along with the other 2 phases. We did round out just over 25,000 survey responses, which have led to inform the foundations and how we evaluate and the overall process and delivery of the recommendations for strategies and solutions to improve mobility in the corridor and beyond. We've also started the framework development process to allow for implementation of any and all of the strategies and solutions that are being recommended through Beyond 77. And this is just a quick snapshot of the evaluation tool, one of the scenarios that we have utilized. As it stands today, based on final feedback and editing and working through CRTPO's group and other parallel initiatives, There are 179 total evaluated strategies and solutions. And then with those 179, several of them have subtasks or toolkit items and associated projects. And so just as an example, one of the strategies is to enhance or provide for general connectivity improvements across or parallel to the interstate. And some of those general connectivity enhancements include several individual project items within geographic zones along the corridor. We are also working with CRTPO to develop a physical takeaway. So that pamphlet that you see in the bottom right corner of your screen is going to be kind of this innovative product for you to take to whichever audience it is that you are going to be working with, whether as a staff person communicating with city management or city management working with elected officials or elected officials communicating to the public. The language is there designed to allow for simple vision, simple takeaway, and simple strategies for action. And that'll then segue and tease into the report and some of the online tools that are being developed as we speak. And finally, as a part of the phase 3 engagement, we created this graphic to help inform the public. There are two different paths forward. One is to just continue to maintain our current system and build in a slow process, or provide further investment, which leads to greater innovation. We offer different methods to invest, which the public was asked to weigh in on, and I will review that feedback shortly. I just canned about 18 months of work into about 90 seconds. Does anybody have any questions about how we arrived to discussing the funding alternatives and some of our suggested regional investment strategies before I continue? All right, well, if you do have questions, pop them in the chat box and we'll come back to you. So I'm going to dive right in here, but I want to give you an overarching preface and context. And I do want to acknowledge two members of the consultant team with me today. Gene Conti, who many of you know, former NCDOT Transportation Secretary, who also worked in the USDOT policy sector. He is joining us today, and he's been helping advise the process from start to finish, especially with policies and a lot of the financial aspects related to this topic discussion today. Also joining us is Mr. Ben Stein. He's been with Atkins for several years, but prior to that, he most recently served as Colorado DOT's Chief Financial Officer and helping to secure many new strategies that exist today on the ground. So without further ado, I want to just give this high-level context of what we wanted to define up front and what we're working to address. And so here we're talking about cost, and we recognize and acknowledge the reality that building, operating, and maintaining transportation infrastructure is quite high. And we go into in the report to kind of help the reader understand why it is that way and what the options are to do something about it. The existing funding mechanisms, which those that are currently in place today are recognized to be insufficient. And I will build on that as we go through this to meet all transportation needs. The next piece is recognizing the capacity that there might be of potential changes in funding. And there are three primary studies that are now past us and proposals to address funding shortfalls. And those are the NC First Commission report, which came out in January of this year, the Charlotte Moose Task Force report, which came out also around the same time and has turned into the Transformational Mobility Network plan. And then the final one is the Committee of 21. And some of you may or may not know what that is. That actually occurred back in 2008. It was a group of 21 folks from around the region that got together to talk about new strategies to help reduce congestion, primarily for the purposes of toll roads and express lane options. Then we went through and defined some of baseline assumptions to then inform how and why we were assigning priority to certain funding alternative mechanisms versus others and the purposes behind them. So item one is listed here first because transportation systems take years to plan, develop, fund, design, construct, and operate. Procrastination here is simply not a viable option. Hence, strategies recommended in the near term are options that are largely considered to be existing traditional methods and strategies, such as sales tax, property tax, and registration fees for local governments in North Carolina. Items 2 through 5 are listed in no particular order, but they are prioritization, being that finding consensus regionally on how to prioritize the regional system's essential elements into a single plan for execution will be no small feat, but critical. We've defined 4 timeframes here, or I'm sorry, 3 timeframes for the purposes of funding: near term, medium term, and long term, stemming from 2022 through 2050, all depending on when some level of regional strategy can be formed and sought public buy-in, if necessary. The 4th one, sustainability, is truly the ability of a particular funding source or set of funding sources in combination to reliably deliver substantial and predictable revenues year after year. And I'll talk a little bit more about the differences between some of those later on. And then the final one, geography. I want to be very specific and clear here, is that what we were talking about today, even though I recognize that the Charlotte region crosses the state line into South Carolina, this is truly a North Carolina focused 10-county area only. Regional perspectives for the Charlotte metro area, minus the 2 to 3 counties that are defined on the South Carolina side. And so to get into the options that we are looking for to be considered in the immediate near term are not necessarily new items. They're all things that are currently in place, but we're talking about them through a regional lens. We're talking about conversations, strategies, some level of unification based on different rate sets or fee sets to achieve a common goal and vision. The first one is regional sales tax, and that can be split into 3 different ways. One is looking at sales tax on current items subject to sales tax as it exists today, which is currently being explored, I believe, through the Charlotte Moves process. Looking at a regional sales tax on the sale of motor fuels, or basically gas. And then the final one for sales tax is looking at actually imposing a sales tax on the sale of your car. The second one is looking at a regional property tax on all property. The third, a regional property tax strategy on vehicles only. And the final one is looking at a regionalized strategy for motor vehicle registration fee assessments. And so if you have your, you guys are already participating, love it. So for those of you that have not participated, if you go to thementee.com, use your code, then you can pop in on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, indicate your preference to support or advocate for each of the following funding strategies that I highlighted on the previous slide. Thank you for those that have participated, and you can choose as many as you want to, but I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on this one.
Adam,
Yes, sir.
under item 1, sales tax, is that generalized sales tax or just sales tax on gasoline? What is that? What sales are you talking about there?
Yeah, so the first one is following the current statutes that define what is applicable for being taxed. What is the goods that are allowed to be taxed today?
So you're talking about general sales tax?
Yes, sir. The second one is specifically only applicable to the sale of gasoline and motor fuels. And the third one is specifically only applicable to the sale of motor vehicles, which is what we call the highway use tax at this point in time.
Yeah, no, the middle one says property tax.
I'm sorry, 1A, B, and C.
But the survey's not broken down that way.
That's correct, yes. So
Which are we looking at?
So we're just looking at the general concept of sales tax, the general concept of property tax, or the context of motor vehicle registration fees. And the reason why I didn't break it out specifically for this purpose is because this is how we simplified it for the public at this point in time. And I'll show you how your answers compare to the public's answers in just a few more slides. Then we'll get into a very more specific slide where we ask your preference to support the individual strategies that I outlined. Sorry about that. Good question, Dr. Mike.
Yeah, so, okay, so it's just sales tax in general, and then we can break it down into what sales of what.
You got it. So I'll give you all a few more seconds to respond. That mentee slide will remain active until I move to the next one. Any questions up to this point before I dive into some of the high-level particulars about each of the breakdowns that I highlighted earlier? All right. So talking about the general sales tax, if we're looking at just Mecklenburg County, it is projected, or it is estimated, that the current half-cent sales tax generates approximately $58 million on an annual basis. General sales taxes were considered in variations by the NC First and Charlotte Moves reports. Committee of 21 recommended a half-cent sales tax increase just 10 years after Mecklenburg County raised it by half a cent for transit in 1998. If there were to be some form of regional strategy where some unification happened on a 10-county region on a half-cent even rate across, that tax could generate an anticipated $195 million annually based on recent spending trends. And we looked at spending trends going back to 2015 for all 10 counties within the metro area. Now, if we shift the thought process to sales tax applicable to only the sale of motor fuels at the gas pump, if set at the average sales tax in the region, which is sitting at 7%, annual revenues would fall within the range of $240 to $250 million. Now, as a part of the report that we've documented, what you're seeing here is only a very minor snippet of what we've documented. The report is roughly 24 pages long, and there's a slew of what we've documented to be advantages and disadvantages. It's essentially a white paper that outlines to a wide variety of audiences for them to understand what are some choices and trade-offs associated with each option in each of the timeframes that we define, so that you are empowered to a certain extent as to how the public would want to work with folks like yourself, Dr. Mike, to then help champion a certain strategy on a local or regional scale. And so, for example, the motor fuel sales tax, an advantage of this is being that it is associated with a user fee principle that is already associated with how service transportation is funded. But a disadvantage here is a slight increase in the cost per gallon of gas could potentially impact the state and region's cost of living and economic competitiveness. Ben Stein, do you have anything else that you might want to offer to this slide and some of those pros and cons?
I certainly could. I could go on for a very long time on the pros and cons of these. An important point about motor fuel sales tax is that it is not currently subject to the sales tax. It is exempt from it. As you know, there's the motor fuel tax that is in place at the state level, which is a cents per gallon, a fixed fee. And in return for that, it has been exempted. So this is an issue because, again, to the pros and cons, North Carolina has a relatively high motor fuel sales tax. Now, the other comment I'll make about the motor fuels tax is a lot of people say, oh, it's not viable going to the future because the sale of gasoline is going to decline with the penetration of electronic vehicles and greater fuel efficiency. I'm going to make a simplistic statement that unfortunately has complications surrounding it. If you make electricity a motor fuel, and it is, it becomes sustainable again. And it's easy to convert the sales tax rate for electricity, if that were to be the case. There are some issues with how to collect it, but that's the Department of Revenue's problem.
And so that's a great point that Ben brings up, is so even though we did not look at an inflection point for EV integration to become the majority, this is being looked at right now as solely motor fuels as the definition stands today in the statute and what the general definition is accepted to be of what motor fuels is. But that can certainly change. So motor fuel sales tax is recommended to be explored in the short term and kind of midterm timeframes. And as that EV market penetration continues to evolve and probably dominate in about 10, maybe 20 years time, then a greater conversation could and should be had as to how do you then capture electricity as a fuel itself, and do you tax that at the same level as the sale of motor fuels? So again, these are all high-level concepts, especially the ones that are kind of out in the latter terms. But we wanted to start having these conversations with all of you that are in positions to have those conversations and to help push one or more of them forward. Continuing on, the concept of a regional motor vehicle sales tax. Right now, it is the highway use tax which is set at 3% of a vehicle's purchase price and is in lieu of any county's sales tax. This concept was not considered by any of the three reports that we documented in the beginning of the presentation. The state of North Carolina has the lowest tax on vehicle sales in the United States. Now, I recognize that there are some caps associated with on the statutes currently that define how a sale of a vehicle can be taxed. If the existing highway use tax is simply doubled on a regional scale, looking at recent spending and sales trends requiring authorization for counties to impose, of course, annual collections are estimated between $35 and $40 million. Anything else that you'd like to add to this concept, or Gene for that matter?
I don't have anything on this one.
Yeah, the cap currently, Adam, is I think $1,000 per vehicle, $1,500 for a RV or that type of vehicle. So even if you doubled it, you wouldn't necessarily collect a lot if the cap is already in place, unless you change the cap.
Right, that's a great point, and I appreciate that insight there, because I mean, that's an important thing to understand, is that the current statutes indicate that there's a cap in place. All of these items will require some form of either public buy-in and or state coordination for change in authorization to do so. But again, it's having that powerful conversation together as a region and as a collective group if there's a desire to push forward innovative investments for infrastructure in the future. And then moving on to the concept of regional property tax, if we're looking at all property. When we looked at the numbers, I was pretty impressed. I didn't realize this, but the property tax base across the 10-county region, according to 2020 numbers, there's approximately a $320 billion valued property tax base. And with a weighted average sitting at about 77 cents per $100 of valuation, each additional 1 cent per that $100 increase would generate between $25 and $30 million annually. The NC First Commission, on a statewide assumption, and Charlotte moves as a secondary option to be considered, reviewed the aspect of property tax increase options. One advantage is the actual cost per property is relatively modest, whereas in a disadvantage, property taxes are typically used to fund a wide array of local government needs. And while some proportions currently may be used for transportation purposes, there may be pushback to increase that proportion if and when a rate increase occurs. Now, of course, you could offset that by making sure that you track the dollars brought in. And so if you allocate whatever that increase that you did on whatever jurisdictional or regional scale, you can allocate towards transportation specifically, as long as you guaranteed that to the public. And so again, this is an interesting concept to be explored further if chosen. Before I seek input, I want to talk about the difference between all property and vehicles only. So here we estimate that there's about 2.1 million vehicles registered in the region with just over $20 billion of value. The reallocation of funds collected from tax for just transportation needs here is sitting at about 156 million. If a new tax is imposed for this purpose, every additional cent increase on the valuation process of just those vehicles would generate approximately $2 million. This was not explored in any of the three reports highlighted earlier. There is a clear linkage to transportation and access to good transportation networks based on just taxing this on a property tax relative to vehicles only. But if redirecting portions of the current taxes collected to transportation, it could cause issues for local jurisdictions to find funding for existing services that are not transportation related. So again, the choice and trade-offs there associated, all of these are in that report that will eventually be published with our final report and our website. I want to just ask and see if there are any questions regarding the concept of property tax, whether all or vehicles only, before I continue. All right.
Adam, just quick clarification. I'm sorry.
Sure.
So this is a percentage. So if it's 20.4 billion, wouldn't that be 2.04 million for every cent?
Ben?
What did you say is the dollar amount, sir?
You said it was the value of all the cars were 20.4 billion. So if you were to impose a 1 cent per, is it percent per dollar of value, correct?
It's a cent per dollar. Yeah, it's based on the value. That is correct.
So
The
wouldn't it be,
$100.
so wouldn't it be 2.04 million a year?
Yes, I rounded. I guess I rounded in the wrong direction.
Okay.
That's my fault. 20, let's just go with, yeah, 2 million.
Because I know I was involved with the committee of 21, and I think we looked at a registration fee. So that was based on just it was assigned to the vehicle. So whatever that percentage was, let's say it was $1, it would be, so if it was $1 a vehicle, it would be 2.1 million as well.
Sure, absolutely.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a perfect segue actually into that concept. So I will say, Andy, we received a final report document there. We couldn't find a whole lot on the products from the committee of 21, but Ned Curran was able to provide us with, I think, was the final report. And he provided, I think he was the chair of that committee, and he provided that to us through a coordination with Gene and some other folks. And so that brings us to, I don't know if the registration fee concept was captured in the final report. Is that correct? But it was considered.
I wasn't sure.
it was one of the finalists.
Okay, gotcha. We'll need to go ahead then and make sure that we incorporate that footnote and reference appropriately.
Sure.
So thank you for that, Andy.
And if you want, I can try to find. It's all been scrubbed from the internet for some reason. So we did track down the final report somewhere, and I don't know where he put it, but if I can track it down quickly, I'll forward it to you just for your information. But there were 4. It was sales tax, tolls, the registration fee. I forget the 4th one at the moment, but if I do track it down, I'll forward it just for your information.
Yeah, sure. That would be
That'd be
very
great.
helpful.
That'd be really helpful.
Okay.
It was frustrating to just have that
right
one. Yeah, it was a little frustrating on that one to only have the report, whereas for the others, I had a lot of other information.
Okay, I'll see what I can find.
Thanks, Andy. So again, a perfect segue to the regional motor vehicle registration fee. Of the 2.1 million vehicles that we estimated to be in the region, about 1.8 million of them were subject to the existing fee of $38.75 that is currently dictated to be the annual fee in the North Carolina Charlotte metro region. Municipalities are allowed to levy up to an additional $30 for street improvements and public transit, which I believe Charlotte and the town of Davidson are the only jurisdiction taking advantage of that levy. Now, I will say, before I talk about that last sentence, the Charlotte Moves plan notes and estimates that just in the city of Charlotte, a $10 increase in that fee for the city would generate approximately 8.8 million. Regionally, applicable to the 1.8 million, if all jurisdictions together magically increase the fee by $30, it is estimated to generate approximately 54 million. So you can kind of see the magnitude of where Charlotte lands itself. So if we took that 8.8 million, multiplied it by 3 for the $30 max, then they kind of make up almost 50%, which makes sense. But that's where that stands. Yes, sir.
But that does not, like Charlotte and, I'm sorry, you said Davidson, we cannot do another $30, correct?
At this point in time, that is correct.
So, but is this last sentence assuming that everybody can do additional 30?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so we require the ability for Charlotte and Davidson to do an additional 30.
Correct.
Okay.
And so, as I told you before, I wanted to show you how your answer stacked up to the way the public weighed in during phase 3. And so it is organized in the same fashion. Regional sales tax at the top, then property taxes. It appears that everybody here that responded is in line somewhat with the public. And so it looks like there's kind of this even tug and pull with sales tax and regional motor vehicle registration fees. I will tell you that there was just shy of 5,000 people that answered that question on the blue bar chart on the left. And both of the top two bars are just over 50% of preference. Whether that is statistically valid or not, that indicates a wide swath of folks responding a general public support of doing something. Does anybody have any questions about that or your feedback and want to just kind of weigh in on what we've heard so far before we get into the next question? All right. Well, the next Mentimeter question is getting at which of those regional strategies that we highlighted would you prefer to champion, whether you are an elected official or a vocal advocate. Which ones would you be interested in seeing to help your jurisdiction, your neighbors, help to champion and support locally and regionally? And so I know that it's small here on the screen, but from left to right, it's the regional sales tax applicable to all items, or general sales tax, regional sales tax increase on the gas tax, regional sales tax increase on the motor vehicle sales. The middle one is I duplicated, so that's my fault. Regional motor fuel sales tax is the same thing. And there's the regional property tax issues, and of course the strategy on motor vehicle registration fees. And you can pick as many as you want here. You don't have to just pick one. So if you like them all, tag them all. Give you guys about 10 more seconds or so. And then I want to just have an open discussion if people are interested or willing to weigh in and provide some insights and thoughts based on those options that we covered at a high level. There's a significant more amount of detail in our report and paper. But if you have questions or thoughts, or maybe an idea went off in your head as to how could such a regional strategy exist, you know, I would love to hear. I'd love to open the floor and just hear your thoughts on that, because I think some of this is traditional stuff, right? This has been explored before, but we're talking about it on a much bigger table, which I don't know has ever really been explored to such a magnitude. And not to put you on the spot, but I noticed that we're joined also by Michelle Nance this morning, planning director with the Central Atlanta COG. We've been in a lot of coordination with their initiative, the Connect Beyond initiative. And so I know that we have talked a lot about they're looking at funding and regional partnerships and what that looks like for the purposes of transit and other mobility efforts. And so, Michelle, I'd love to just ask your thoughts on this type of strategy discussion and what it means for the region, or what it could mean for the region.
Thanks. And this wasn't set up, by the way. I would just say, in general, local governments looking at their property tax, they kind of guard that, and you know, they don't want to say that taxes are going up, and you know, I think it would be a really tough sell to do any type of property tax increase across the region. Just knowing what I know about local governments, the sales tax piece. I see Dr. Mike raising his hand. the sales tax piece may be a little more tenable. And I had not really thought much about the motor fuels tax before now. I mean, that has benefits of, you know, you get folks that are coming into the area, not just residents. And that could be a real selling point. But I think it really goes into making sure that everybody would be all in. That would be the tough part.
Yeah, no, appreciate that, Michelle. Thank you. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot there, but I appreciate the flexibility.
Yeah.
Dr. Mike, did you want to add anything, or were you just saying, yep, property taxes? we covered it?
No, I wanted to add something.
Yes, sir.
As far as the property tax, Cornelius is in the inevitable, I stumble over words. We got a lot of projects coming from the state in Cornelius, and we are looking at our match. So a couple of years ago, we raised our property taxes $0.015 and put it in a separate account just for those transportation projects. And the citizens seem to be happy with that, because the three major problems in Cornelius are traffic, and guess what? Traffic. So they just said, yes, we are willing to pay more property taxes if it means our roads are going to be fixed. As far as the transit sales tax, North Mecklenburg has a bad taste in its mouth. That would be a hard sell. We would have to have a hard list of what we're getting out of the deal, because as we all know, the red line is nowhere to be seen for 20 years. So that's just from the North Mech perspective. The other thing that you did not list is alternate funding mechanisms, such as a mileage tax, which I think is got a lot of legs. I'm trying to think of an analogy that goes into moving, but I think a mileage tax, especially if it goes nationwide, has a lot of credibility, because again, you get that feeling that if I'm using it, I'm paying for it. So those are my comments.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're thinking about that. That's on the next slide. So that's perfect. You read all of our minds, so thank you. Gold star to Dr. Mike this morning. Any other comments from those on the call before I do continue into Dr. Mike's perfect segue? All right, well, thank you again for the feedback on this mentee, and thank you all for that comments. We are going to now talk about some different strategies that could be explored regionally on a mid to long-term basis. And when I say mid to long-term, I'm talking beyond 2030. And so even before 2030, to start the conversations on what these could look like. And I'm going to start with the concept of a mileage-based user fee, which is exactly what Dr. Mike was getting at. Currently, the state of North Carolina is in the midst of what we're calling MBUF, pilot or study. Once complete and a statewide MBUF is implemented, a regional MBUF could be explored further. There is not a precedent set on this concept per a regional level. Other states implementing pilots, such as Oregon, they have the most well-known successful pilot, but nothing has actually been set institutionally anywhere in the country on a statewide level. An MBUF, as Dr. Mike was saying, is a user-based fee charge based on miles driven within a specific geography, usually a state. A regional MBUF is a supplemental fee charged for miles driven in that subregion that is paid to a regional or local authority for its use in maintaining and operating surface transportation assets. And so just as you said, Dr. Mike, this is an application that is growing. There are lots of cases happening that are interstate based. So the I-95 Coalition, which now has a new name, they are doing this larger analysis of what it looks like to do commerce across the entire East Coast along I-95, and that has expanded to try to understand implications of how that is managed on a state level versus kind of making disbursements of funds. It's all kind of up to the state and local jurisdiction on how it works, but the same concept can be applied to a metropolitan region as well. So if there was a desire to impose a regional fee on top of a state base, that is something that could be explored in the mid to long term. Yes, sir.
So that, are you implying GPS data is coupled with the mileage So you know which region somebody's in.
I don't. That's a sticky. Go ahead, Ben.
That becomes the sticky wicket because people don't want their privacy data abridged.
Of course.
So, yeah.
How does the city of London? I know some cities charge a fee for going into the inner city. I think London's one of them. How do they get around that? Do you know, Adam?
I think Ben does.
Yes. So I'm going to do two things here real quickly. I'm going to address your question here, and then I'll talk. The cordon fees are addressed later in the presentation. The key issue why this is not, as much as I personally like and believe that we do ultimately need to go to an MBUF, the cost of implementation of this strategy is so high for the initial conversion that to do it at anything less than the state and possibly a region, when I say region, I mean multi-state region, is simply not viable. I can't find any practical way to do this on a region, on a 10-county region, for example. If the state were to implement it, you could then put this fee on top of it. To your question about GPS, there are a number of ways you could do it. One of which, and there are many ways to protect people's privacy, which is certainly important. One option, for example, which has its pluses and minuses, is to say, if the car is registered in the region, whatever miles it drives, it gets charged. You could also use GPS and have it only be miles that are within it. And of course, another reason why you'd like it to be a statewide plan is that if a car from Raleigh-Durham drives miles in your region, it should pay miles in your region. But for that, of course, we would have to know where the miles are driven, and there would have to be some sort of savings of that, and then some other means to protect people's data. Now, if you want me to spend the next half hour, I'll be happy to, talking about privacy and data and the issues surrounding it, and how you could possibly protect it. But it is a big issue. There are means to protect it. And the other critical issue with this is there are a lot of people, once they track your data, want to charge what I would call finesse this. A mile is not a mile. They want to know what mile is being driven at what time, what location. So for example, if you're driving in downtown Charlotte at 8 o'clock in the morning, they want to charge you more for that mile than a mile being driven in Union County. So there are a lot of nuances associated with this once you start tracking data specifically to location.
And they may also want to charge a different rate per mile based on time of day.
Time of day and location. At which point there are people not only are concerned about privacy, but are saying that it's social engineering. So those sorts of things all need to get worked out, plus the cost of implementation, which is why this strategy that has been talked about for well over a decade now has still not actually been implemented yet. And I believe it's going to be another 5 to 10 years before it finally is.
But as many of us do know, or maybe not, is that the NC First Commission did explore this quite heavily. And so that is, we've kind of dovetailed off of their analysis as well, and supplemented with regionally tailored advantages and disadvantages as part of our paper to help inform on the more local regional scale here. Good questions though, Dr. Mike, and we will get to the cordon congestion pricing in just a second.
Adam, I would like to get input from Loretta regarding the federal level. Anything she can share about the MF or mileage-based fee?
Not really. We study it. We study what other states are doing, but in the end, most of it ends up being a state decision. Whether or not those mileage-based fees are charged, it would be very difficult to do it from a national perspective, and then be able to distribute it back in a fair way, which is all formula-based with us, not necessarily. I mean, it's based on population, but it gets to be pretty complicated.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Moving on to another concept is that of a regional business improvement district. Before I read that long paragraph to you, I do want you to understand that you may or may not already know that 3 bids actually exist in Charlotte already. One is the entire extent of Uptown within the 277 loop. South End became its own, directly abutting the Uptown bid. And then of course, the third one is up in the university area. And those are all managed by the group's Charlotte Center City Partners, that they do special planning for those and help to foster the improvements in them. But a bid is simply a defined area within which businesses are required to pay an additional tax or fee to fund projects within those districts' boundaries. And those districts typically fund services that are beyond those performed by government with its existing tax revenues. And so they typically choose to pay these to ensure they have the transportation facilities to make their locations more attractive to customers or accessible to meet their needs. Such examples often include improved traffic signals, sidewalk, roads, transit stops, etc. I think one of the interesting things here is that we don't really talk about constraining the concept of a bid as a part of our paper. With the three that I highlighted that are currently existing today are very fixed, localized spots with a lot of intensity happening. But in our previous workshop, we did talk about considering an entire corridor-based bid or enhancing around transit station areas associated with mass transit lines, regardless of what type of technology it is. But defining each transit station, we're talking TOD study areas are happening now in the Charlotte area. How to then maybe those become some aspect of a bid around each one based on a certain radius from the station. Again, all options to be considered in the mid to longer term period. And I know that I may have just kind of said some buzzwords that may have caused some issues there, but again, it's causing a thought process to occur beyond what is being looked at today. And so, yes, Mr. Grinsky.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious, and I know any number you come up with would be a wag, but I mean, do you have just kind of a ballpark of what you'd be even thinking that could generate? And then also, what would that actually be used to fund? Because, I mean, obviously, improving 77 itself is astronomical cost. So I'm just curious of what kind of improvements you're thinking would be funded by this bid. And then also how much ballpark do you think that could generate?
Ben, I would love for you to start that, and I might finish based on what you say. Ben, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I have two, it turns out I have two mute buttons. Okay, so the answer is essentially no. It depends on, so much depends on what the bid is designed for. A bid is something that is essentially people voluntarily come together to then ultimately, so you'd have to have them coalesce on what the size of the bid is, what type of bid it is. Is it going to be for retail areas? Is it going to be for industrial areas to improve access in and out for freight? Is it going to be a transit-oriented thing? You'll notice I say the revenues derived most commonly from a tax assessment on commercial property owners, but that's not necessarily the only option. You could have an option that's based upon numbers of linear feet of frontage road or number of access points. There are all sorts of different possibilities for how they choose to assess themselves. So this is a highly flexible, and a critical element is how large would it be? I'll be honest with you, I do not see people gathering in a bid type arrangement to fix I-77 as an example. However, a critical arterial, or I could certainly see it happening. And almost certainly this would be only in commercial areas, not in residential areas.
And Andy, you do bring up a good point that I want to make sure that we convey and that we are making sure the messaging is clear, is that we certainly know that a lot of our infrastructure solutions are focused in and around the Interstate 77 corridor and that 6-mile swath that we talked about a year and a half ago that served as our foundation. But when we started to look at reduce, like the goal of reducing congestion on the interstate, well, the interstate is truly a regional asset. that is used by everybody for the most part, not just those that live and work directly within the corridor that we define geographically. And so that's why we're looking at funding strategies on a 10 county basis, because then there could be other projects that could help reduce the congestion or the use of the interstate as it exists today, so the congestion doesn't continue to grow. And so I wanted to make sure that that was conveyed, so that we certainly know that this was designed to talk about infrastructure solutions in and around the interstate, but we didn't want to leave out everybody else that might use it too.
And an important point, when I say a regional business improvement district, let me just throw in, normally the bids that Adam talked about are all pretty local.
Yeah.
But they don't have to be, and I'll use it a good example. So along the commuter rail line, we talked about TOD. You could take, I think this would be very viable to say, we're going to create a regional business improvement district for TOD improvements along the entire line.
Yeah.
And have the businesses that are within some radius around every stop joined together in a single one, and that would gradually build out the improvements across the entire line. That would be an example of a bid that's regional.
I just think for our practical purposes, though, these are, like you say, a defined area that, you mentioned Charlotte has 3. I could see if that was all one, and then there'd be, I'm sure, some people who feel that one bid area is benefiting more from another area and so forth. So I feel I could be, I just never seen like something, when you say regional, I just feel like that could be more a political issue, that feel like that certain areas may be subsidizing other areas and some areas are benefiting more and so forth. So I think you'd still have to kind of delineate, and maybe you broke it into smaller bids along the way. But it seems like if I'm paying into it, you normally want to see that benefit nearby instead of 30 miles away.
No, that's fair. And I love your thought process already, because you're already trying to ask challenging questions based on our challenging proposal, right? So we're already asking you to think outside the box a little bit more. And I think you're trying to think through how it could exist in 15 years. But obviously there are things to work around if this were to become a thing one day, one decade. So no, thank you, Andy. I appreciate that. Any other comments on a regional bid concept before I move on to the last one? All right, the last one is looking at a regionally established transportation as a utility. And so Ben is the expert on this one, even though it doesn't exist anywhere yet. I think it is a truly fascinating concept that could be explored in a longer term basis. But transportation is obviously essential for our access to basic necessities, not unlike how we access electricity and water. Users would pay fees for the use of the transportation system with rates set through a formal rate setting process reflective of the cost of the full gamut of constructing, operating, and replacing it. Ben, do you have other context that you would like to provide here that could set the stage for what this conversation could look like in the mid to long term time frame?
So the important point here is, normally when you see the term user here, when it comes to transportation, you think of people who either getting on a bus, getting on a train, or driving a car. A user in this case is anybody who gets the benefit of the transportation system. That means essentially, and that means everybody, just like water and electricity. Remember, just because you don't drive a car or don't even use the bus doesn't mean you don't benefit. Amazon's delivering your package, you're going on the sidewalk, the public safety has to use the road to get to you if you need help. So everybody has a fundamental benefit. The concept here is a formal rate setting process, Public Utility Commission type deal, where they capture the cost of operating and maintaining the system, and they set fees, and people would be sent bills. When I say people, users. What is a user? A user is a business. A user is a resident. This is the methodology of who and how you get billed might be tied to your vehicle registration, number of vehicles or types of vehicles, but it could be based upon your number of access points into the system. It could be based on, again, the linear footage of your frontage, the square footage of your property. There are many different possibilities for doing this. This is a concept, as Adam has correctly pointed out, lots of talk, nobody's done it yet, but it does solve the problem that, just like with electricity and water, the full cost of the system is collected. So this is a sort of the grand solution in a sense, because you're going to get sent a bill. Now, the interesting question is with water and electricity, of course, what they do is if you don't pay your bill, they cut off your water or your electricity. The question that's interesting here is if somebody fails to pay their bill, how do you cut off their access? And that's sort of the one rub at the moment, but that's the concept.
Ben, are you at all familiar with what Austin, Texas? I thought they were looking at something like that. I don't know if it was an ongoing annual fee but I thought it was almost like a driveway use permit type thing that there was some revenue generated by.
I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, I thought that either they.
I'll see if I can take a look. Austin, Texas.
Yeah, I believe it. Yeah, I thought that's what they were kind of looking at. Just exactly what you said, basically treating it as a utility.
Yeah.
But it would probably be tied to maybe number of driveways, and almost treating a driveway as a connection to the water system or something like that.
Right. Driveways and for example, for commercial properties, how many bays and docks do you have at your facility?
Right.
Yeah.
Andy, I'm not aware of a study in Texas, but we will look at it. I know Los Angeles, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, they were thinking about this, or right before COVID-19. In 2019, they were looking at trying to evaluate the possibility of this. I think that conversation is on hold.
Another, I'm not going to say negative, but a downside to this is that you are only impacting the people who actually live in the area. And since Charlotte is such a regional crossroads, you're not really tapping that revenue of the people who are using the system, but are just going through.
True enough, but people constantly tell me how important it is to factor in the people that transit the area. If you have a mileage-based user fees, you'll solve that problem at some point. For freight does that to a certain extent to the state. I have to admit, I wonder. I've never seen a quantification of how much of the traffic going is true through traffic. And if it's a 10-county region, you largely mitigate the locality issue, because I can't imagine that there's that large a percentage of people who aren't within the 10-county region.
All right.
Yeah, and I think we probably have those numbers somewhere, but I mean,
love to see them.
Yeah, we have modelers.
Okay.
We could talk to. Because bottom line though, with 77 is a major north-south corridor and 85 is a major east-west, north-south. So there are a lot of people who are just going through.
Sure, but if it's 5%, is it really that material? And do they really create the congestion that creates the need to expand the highway as opposed to the local commuter?
Sure.
All good points. I appreciate that conversation. With interest time, I do want to continue on. Mr. Cooksey, I'm so glad that you're on today's call as well as last week. You'll see the changes to the next slide. But I do want to make sure that I give some caveats here before we have a comment on this. We do document a few alternatives of funding that are not viewed as sustainable or sufficient for broad, continuous applications to meet growing local or regional needs. And I will get into some more details on that, but the first one is the concept of additional federal funding. There has not been any local control or no increase since 1993 for federal funding purposes on making sure there's an increase. We're talking about the gas tax. And then the one-time funding opportunities such as ARA or the pending infrastructure stimulus is not a long-term solution. It is temporary. Same aspect for number 2. Oh, by the way, I do want to caveat there as well. The federal funding concept of not being sustainable or sufficient does not account for the existing formula funds that are relied upon by existing systems such as transit and other factors currently at play in the region. Looking at state additional funding from the state DOT or state of North Carolina, the state already has fairly high tax rates, and whatever increases it may enact, it will be directed to NCDOT's needs, potentially on their schedule. And we have learned that there is some level of a gap between the level of revenue available and the needs that are existing today and will continue to become needs as we continue these large planning efforts. The third one is the concept of tolls, tolled express lanes or tolled highways. They are critical for the facilities that they directly support. And so they are a great function to help reduce congestion, provide that option, and they collect money to allow for construction, operation, and maintain maintenance of the facility that it runs on. And the final one we do, Dr. Michael Lee brought up cordon pricing. It is being done in London, or congestion pricing. It is purely for traffic management purposes, and it is not used for generalized revenue generation for its primary goal. And so now that I've gotten that off my chest, I want to see if there's any comments about those as being viewed as not sustainable or sufficient for broad applications. Yes, Mr. Cookson.
Adam, I'll jump in.
Yes.
Because I've been thinking about this since the last one, and I appreciate your response, but I think I can help better this time than I did last time with another suggestion of alternate wording.
Okay.
But I hope the light bulb goes off.
Yeah.
If I think back to the beginning of the presentation, there's a choice presented between funding additional items or the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
Under further thought, I would like to suggest that perhaps the wording that should be in italics it ties back into that status quo and said alternatives not viewed as sufficient for needs beyond the status quo, or for activities or strategies beyond the status quo.
Got it.
And that encapsulates that federal funding is addressing some status quo issues, state funding is addressing status quo issues, tolled express lanes and highways do address status quo issues, and however you want to apply it to the cordon or congestion pricing notion, but because that one stands out since it's the one of the 4 that we don't actually have in the region. But I after further thought, looking at your presentation, I think tying these things to being what the status quo is, I think settles some of the interpretation concerns. What do you think?
I completely agree with you, actually. You're right, because the language of status quo to me, and some of you on the call today, may just imply the way that we have our infrastructure built today is it, and
Yes.
That's all we're going to do. I completely understand what you're saying now, and that change on that graphic we made, as well as messaging and how we document that. I appreciate that wholeheartedly.
Well, I always like it when I can suggest an edit that's based on material you've already got. So yeah, you already established what the duality is. I think that you've got that framework to call these 4 items, well, at least 3 of the 4 items by that term already. These are status quo. They are not anything additional than that.
That's perfect.
Thank you.
You had your coffee this morning, I can tell.
Hey, Adam, this is Gene. Just
Yes,
to
sir.
add on the state funding issue, I heard yesterday that the SPOT working group is going to recommend to the board next week, I guess, in the August board meeting at DOT, to suspend the SPOT 6.0 programming effort because they've done a total reevaluation, re-estimation of all the existing projects in the TIP, and there's no room for new projects in the TIP, at least for the next year or 2.
Wow.
So, so that process is going to shut down here fairly soon, and we may be till fall of 22 or 23 before we start back up again. So
Wow.
anybody hoping for more state funding absent any major legislative action is dreaming. So,
All right, that is good information to have. So I'm gonna, I guess thank you, Gene, for that, by the way. The next slide is really just talking about the open discussions. I feel like we had some of that already. Thank you, Warren, for that information. I want to check the chat box just to make sure that I'm up to date with all this stuff. And Kathy, thank you for the correction on the University City Partners there. We'll have to explore more in the model data just to understand that information, but appreciate that information, Alex, as well. So any other comments or feedback or open discussion on the information that you have, we have talked about for the mid or long-term aspects today? I think we kind of interjected together. So any other thoughts before I continue on? All right. Well, I really appreciate the conversations. I think that we are certainly challenging the topics in a good way to kind of start that larger discussion point, as I know that some other initiatives are encouraging some larger regional conversations as well. So having them happen together will be a solid step in the right direction. Just want to highlight really quickly on the connection with parallel planning initiatives, just so that you are aware that this was not done in a vacuum whatsoever. And you've already heard me allude to that a little bit. The NC First Commission, of course, we followed that very closely in partnership with Tony Lathrop, Gene Conti, and Julie Eisel. Julie and Tony both served on that commission. And so we tracked that moving forward, and it just happened to wrap up about the time we started working on this task. So we were very well up to date on what we wanted to address and accommodate. The Charlotte Moves Task Force also wrapped up at the same time as NC First Commission and their report. And so understanding what Mecklenburg County and the city of Charlotte was attempting to do in the short term with helping to fund some of their large infrastructure investments associated with the Transformational Mobility Network. The third one down there, the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance is doing a Transformational Mobility Network economic impact analysis. That information should be released in the coming weeks, and they are truly going to write about broad and very specific, generalized and user-specific economic impact outputs. And so we are trying to align our revenue assumptions with, or additional revenue assumptions beyond the status quo with what those economic impacts could be. So folks like yourself, Dr. Mike, can do a one-to-one storytelling piece. So you see what revenues could be collected. Well, here's what you get with that additional revenue based on economic output. We're also coordinating with CRTPO 2050 MTP and of course Connect Beyond. You heard me talk about and convey with Michelle Nance we have here on the call, and then Jorge Luna is helping lead that from the consultant side with HDR. They're exploring a funding and partnerships concept on what that looks like on a local and regional scale. Any thoughts or questions on these 5 critical items where we are trying to coordinate and align our messaging and outputs?
It's just funny about how all this is coming at the same time.
It's truly impressive, actually. It's really quite amazing for Charlotte and the region.
And as your CRTPO chair, I seem to be in, at least on the edge of the storm.
Well, you're about to be pulled into the eye of it pretty soon, for sure. So, any other thoughts or comments on these before I continue on? We're going to have some interactive stuff with Mentimeter again. All right. Working with Augustine and CRTPO folks, we have actually have a series of questions prepared asking you all as citizens, elected officials, and advocates of the region some of the post-study expectations of how this could turn into something active beyond the Beyond 77 effort. And so this first question, we really are curious, it's open-ended. Would like to hear your feedback from your thoughts as to what level of action is necessary, whether it's adoption, endorsement, and or acceptance, is appropriate and necessary, and by whom. And so last week we had a good discussion as to what boards or commissions or local jurisdictions would need to take appropriate actions to support and or acknowledge, but curious from this group what your thoughts are. And so I know, Dr. Mike, you're wearing a couple of hats on this call today. And so just be curious, maybe just from your perspective, what your thoughts are on this one.
And
Well-
this is, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, a couple hats. I mean, the town of Cornelius, we're a small little municipality, and we are in the midst of, you know, in between Davidson and Huntsville, so we can represent North Meck. But the other bigger hat is CRTPO, which is, you know, the tri-counties. And certainly that'll be a much bigger bullhorn than what I can get out of little town of Cornelius.
Michelle?
I apologize for interrupting. Just for clarification, this is for the plan itself, not for a particular policy about funding.
Augustine? I
That is
believe that's
correct. Michelle, that is correct.
Okay.
So we're seeking, I just want to give a little bit more context here. The one of the three, initially with CRTPO board. We're looking at the highest of these. Of course, we're going to be in a conversation with CRTPO leadership to see which one of those will be appropriate. However, we want to hear from this group, from our committees, what is your recommendation? So initially will be either adoption or endorsement, assuming those are much higher than acceptance. Follow after CRTPO, do one of those two or accept it. Then we go to other partners and agencies for the lower level of action. So in that case, will be either endorsement or acceptance.
On the, you know, Michelle brought up a really great question. I realize I jumped right into this part of the presentation without zero context, as we were talking about money, and now we're talking about the whole plan itself, which a part of it is money. But we're not talking about any specific policy to go after a certain funding strategy at this point in time. There is a recommendation for exploration of developing a regionalized funding strategy as a part of Beyond 77, but that is where it stops. It does not highlight anything beyond that. And so I'll give everybody, you know, 5-10 more seconds to just enter in text here. If you have thoughts, if you have further thoughts that maybe you want to convey to Augustine or myself, please email those to us. We are interested in your thoughts on this to make it a reality, because a lot of work has come out of this, as well as some other initiatives. And I think that there's a lot of desire to push a lot of them forward. And how do we do that together in concert? The next question I'd like to pose to you all is, again, talking about the greater plan itself and implementing aspects related to Beyond 77. Do you think, on a scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree, that a new program could be formed and sustainable into the future to allow for implementation of Beyond 77 and other initiatives? If anybody would like to provide context as to the choice they selected, please feel free to jump in. If not, we can continue on. I would love there to be open dialogue about these concepts as we progress through the questions. But again, I'll give everybody about 10 more seconds to respond if you're still thinking on it. Anybody have any feedback on this as to what their thoughts might be?
We got someone disagreeing. Like to hear from that, if they would like to share their thoughts.
And maybe while that person is thinking that, you know, Michelle, thank you. The concept of a program is vague for sure. But I think at this point, a lot of it is still vague. Augustine, I know that you guys are exploring in CRTPO as to what this would look and feel like to you all and others in the region that you coordinate with. So any more thoughts on what is a program?
So yes, Michelle, I see your comment. Ideally, we need to keep anything out of Beyond 77 moving forward. We will need to create or maintain some type of group, some type of whether it's a working group or that is propelling and is taking and creating or moving forward with those recommendations or with any of the recommendations. So instead of just leaving it up to CRTPS staff or leaving it to a person to run with that. So that will be part of that new program.
And I would say on top of that, Augustine, based on the presentation that Connect Beyond did on July 22nd, I would say that even though we have not gone through the exercise of creating org charts of actions and responsible folks, is that it could look something like that.
And thanks for the clarification. Yeah.
All right, any other comments on this slide before we continue to the next question? All right, next question is, as an elected official or vocal advocate in the region, how do you think you could champion such a program to be created and successful? It is open-ended text. And so curious as to all of you that live and work here and serve here, what would be successful for you? And maybe while all of you are contemplating the thoughts on that, Gene, Conti, I would love for your perspective. I know that you have had several years of experience doing lots of regional and interstate coordination on investments and infrastructure. What are your thoughts on this type of concept pushing and progressing forward to advance investment into infrastructure here? What does it
It's
look
hard.
like to you?
No, I think it's very hard, but there are examples around the country of regions pulling together. San Diego's had quite a bit of success in getting local option sales taxes and things like that to support specific projects developed by the planning organizations. Minneapolis, similar situation. So there are examples around the country where regions have pulled together to try to solve some of their transportation challenges, but it's a very politically difficult, not in a partisan sense, but just getting people to understand that collaboration means everybody has to be trusted to give their best input, and everybody has to be trusted to deliver on whatever the results produce, whatever the agreement is about how to move forward. So it's difficult when you have local jurisdictions may not all have the same views about what the problems are, and certainly don't have the same views about what the solutions are to start with anyway. Maybe after some long dialogue, everybody can come to that kind of consensus, but it's hard work. It's difficult, but it does have a payoff at the end in places where it's been successful. It's had a huge payoff in terms of improved mobility and more transparent governance in terms of people trusting the government to come up with solutions and ways to solve problems and do it in a way that people can see and understand.
Perfect. Thank you, Gene. And I see the one last comment that was provided here on the screen. Solutions have to be broad-based. And I would like to share with all of you that Augustine and I sat in on a coordination meeting on Monday where there was a desire to see how all the recommendations coming out of Beyond 77's work were somehow related to or in some relation aspect to Connect Beyond, as well as the Transformation Mobility Network. And so there's this exercise that is ongoing as we speak. And we're realizing that there's different levels of specificity as to what is arising from recommendations, which is exciting because some are very broad-based, as you're saying, and some get very specific. And so there's kind of this sequence that is allowing for this huge vision to take shape all at the same time, as we had pointed out earlier, that it's all happening together. And so more to come on that, but the broad-based factor is captured. Dr. Mike, you want to?
Yeah, your broad-based solutions can be very specific in different regions, in different areas, but it's seen as a broad-based solution that's being applied across the whole region with specific applications.
100%. I appreciate that feedback. You're right. It's both. You're right. You're right.
Absolutely.
So I want to move on to the interest of time. This is an interesting question to ask. So I will say the public was asked this question. As an elected official or vocal advocate in the region, what challenges might you foresee that would prevent a new program success? And I think some of you did comment a little bit on the challenging perspective on the previous question, but I'm curious as to what your thoughts are here. I will tell you, as you are putting your answers together for this, the public was asked this same question, and almost 3,000 individual responses were collected, and some of those responses had multiple sub-responses to them, and they weighed into it. And so that is all public as a part of the dashboard that was put on our project website, and you can see what people's perceived challenges would be. I will tell you, hands down, some of the biggest ones were politics, lack of money, and Augustine, I'm blanking. Politics and lack
Actually,
of money.
yes, I think last time we got time to visit some of the dashboard. I posted the link in the chat box, but
Getting reelected.
yeah, it was surrounding money deficits and
People.
in politics, right?
Yeah.
Agendas, political agendas, and things of that nature. Perhaps I would say were the top two themes from the public.
Yeah.
We're seen as a challenge.
If you have any thoughts, please email us. I do want to continue in the interest of time. We have a couple more questions, and I think Augustine wants to convey some of our next steps to get us to implementation. What are your thoughts on, if you have any immediately off the top of your head, if you have a light bulb thought right there, what could be the name of a new program? We certainly had some interesting thoughts last week. So I'm curious if you have something on the tip of your tongue, throw it at us really quick, and then we'll have something creative on the next slide in just a second to help. You know, whoever wrote Beyond literally was the same thing as last week, so that's awesome. Somebody was thinking the same.
That is
as you.
strange. It was the first comment,
That's
and it's not us.
Yeah, we didn't stage that.
we got some good comments last week. So good ideas.
And I think you guys are going to have a little more fun with the next one. Again, if you have other thoughts that we don't get seen on the slide, you can go back and participate in the Mentimeter thing, but I do want to go to the next one. So let's assume that social media is leveraged to the extent that it was for Beyond 77's process. As you know, we had incredible success. Whoops, I went too far. Nope, I was wrong. I lied to you. This one first is, do you think social media could be leveraged? Agree or disagree, essentially. Social media and digital marketing made Beyond 77 wildly successful, whether you knew it or not. That was allowed us to reach a lot more people than we typically would or traditionally would go after. And so very excited about that. There, of course, are minimal costs associated with doing it, but with the right people in-house or consultant purposes, there's ways to be very creative about it.
And let me add something to this particular point here. It's about marketing.
Mm-hmm.
Because we engineers and planners and even politicians, we got this feedback from many people actually during phase 3 was we good at doing plans, putting construction documents together, reports, but not so well when it comes to selling something. So this is why this is going to be key for anything after September 30th, to leverage on that impressive public engagement that we gathered over the last 20 months or so far, but to continue that momentum with the public and make sure that we are showing something out of it, that we're making progress and not just becoming a report.
Yeah. So with the interest of time, we'll go to the last question. So let's say social media is leveraged and we want to make it go viral and we want it to trend. What would you want the hashtag to be that could be universally applied? That's classic. I don't know if that fits within the Twitter character limit or not, but you made it work, whoever wrote that one. Again, I'll give everybody about 20 seconds to put their hashtag thoughts together. We had some great feedback last week as well. And so open to your ideas before we jump forward. And if you have a light bulb moment later as you're eating lunch, please feel free to email Augustine and myself. Oh, that's creative. I like that.
No, our apologies that we're going over the time. I know last week we ended right at the 90-minute mark. I just ask you to please bear with us another 3 or 4 minutes, if that's possible. But I will understand if you have to jump on off the call right now.
All right, very good. Again, if you have light bulb moments, please feel free to email them to us and we will make sure that we incorporate in the summary of what we go through. I do just want to quickly acknowledge, and then we'll dive into the additional questions and next steps. My team is exploring the development of a funding alternatives tool so that folks like yourself, Dr. Mike, or other folks that work within jurisdictions can play with numbers based on different rates and regional strategies. And you can select different counties that would participate, and you can set the rates and the timeframes for application. We are still in process of making that happen, but we are also in the process of making sure that it feels a little bit like the NC First Commission's crafts tool. Theirs was way more advanced because they have a lot more issues to deal with, but we are trying to go down that path. And then again, as I said, draw the one-to-one alignment with the economic outputs that ITRI and CRBA are working on. So more to come on that later in the summer, but that is in development and it will be a tool available online eventually. So with that, I'll let Augustine take back over and let everybody know what's coming next.
Just want to open it for any final comments or questions. And if not, please send us any feedback by Friday. I'll be sending an email really quickly within the next hour or two to both groups, everyone that joined us last week and through this meeting today, with highlighting some of those action items. Likewise, next we have with Boston, the consultant that helped us with the public engagement. They're going to be presenting on August the 18th. And on the same week, we expected to have the initial draft of the final report. That will be the first deliverable, the final report. There will be a series of other deliverables, but everything we built out of the final document. And then as of right now, we have scheduled a meeting on September 8th. September 8th. It's yet to be determined if we're going to be able to conduct a hybrid of in-person and virtual or just virtual. But more to know in the upcoming weeks, hopefully before the middle of August. And then the final deliverables are expected on September the 30th. The next day, October 1st, we'll begin the implementation of Beyond 77. But with nothing else, again, I just want to thank you for your time, your patience, all your feedback throughout this entire process. By the time we get done in September will be 2 years, 24 months working with for that vision of improvements along the I-77 corridor that we all know as Beyond 77. So thank you so much. And we are adjourned. There's nothing else.
Thank you.
Thank you.